So have you ever had that experience where you mention to someone that you've been reading a book and they ask you what it's about and you're like, I've definitely been there before. And it's not a great feeling, but it's also pretty common because most people read most books without a good strategy for remembering what's in them. So over the past few years, I've developed a 3-part strategy for remembering and using the most interesting, insightful, and perspective-shifting parts of almost everything I read. It's kind of based on a combination of other people's systems, but it's also based on the latest science about learning and recall and what just personally works for me. And so in this video, I'm going to take you through what I do from the moment I crack open a book to what I do in the week or so after I finish it. And by the end, you'll understand a system that will let you remember and use the most important bits of whatever you're reading, whether you're reading 1 book a year or 50. And it all starts with learning to take better notes. So for a long time, the only way I would take notes when I was reading was to highlight passages on my Kindle. And this isn't exactly bad. It's easy to do, you can go over them from any linked device anywhere, and there are apps that will automatically resurface them so that you don't forget them. But actually, one of the things I just mentioned is kind of the problem with taking notes on a Kindle. Because the thing is, the fact that it's so easy to highlight passages from a book, either on Kindle or with a highlighter pen, can give you the feeling that you're learning and understanding the material, when actually you really aren't. So actually what I do instead is write down a combination of direct quotes and what Sonka Arens, the author of this book, calls literature notes. And what he suggests for these is to make them short, cite the source and details when you do them, and crucially, use your own words. And I think this is what makes a huge difference. If you're capturing a direct quote because you love the way it's phrased, that's fine. But if you want to understand and internalize ideas, it's really important to be able to express them in your own words. And so what I try to do is have a notebook with me whenever I'm reading so I can make notes as I go. If that's not possible, I'll fold down the nearest page corner so I can come back to it later. Obviously you can use index tabs if that's what works for you or you don't want to bend all your books back. But to be honest, I'm very rarely in a place where I'm going to remember to have index tabs with me, but not a notebook, so I don't bother. If I'm on the Kindle, I will still use the highlight function, but that's fine because the most important bit is what you do with these notes in the next step, which is to make connections. So once you've got your literature notes in place, the next step is to decide what's important and useful and what just seemed kind of cool when you read it. You'll then decide what information to keep and what information to discard, but crucially you're also going to categorize that information, which should help you see connections between what you're learning for the first time and the stuff that you already know. So what you're actually doing at this stage is going through the notes you've made, whether they're on Kindle, in a notebook, or just turned over pages, and writing them down in a permanent form. And the way I do this is to add them to a list of categories that are useful to me. The Smart Notes system is actually a little bit more complicated than this, and involves giving your notes keywords and location codes. But using categories is a simpler idea that I've borrowed from Ryan Holiday, and it works really well for me. So my current categories include life advice, which is basically just helpful stuff about living better, which I'm going to use for myself personally. Health, which I kind of use for my own workouts, but also for work stuff that I write sometimes. Writing, learning, history, and newsletter ideas. And so I just have a Google document for each of these. You could use Notion, Obsidian, or even just a stack of index cards, but the most important thing is that you have a system that lets you reshuffle things, because what you're going to want to be able to do is cut and paste ideas into different places and look for connections between them. And so something to do when you rewrite your notes is to try and connect them to other ideas that you already have. So an idea I came across in this book was that one reason Galileo and then Isaac Newton were so interested in gravity was that warfare had been waged with cannonballs for a couple of hundred years by the point they came around. And the way cannonballs fly is kind of an easy way to conceptualize certain things about gravity. And then I read somewhere else that Galileo's work on parabolas might have helped an artist called Artemisia Gentileschi get the blood spatter right on her paintings. And so I think there are some really fascinating ideas in there about how the history of art and science have kind of intertwined over time. And so I might one day talk more about that in my newsletter, link in the comments, but for now, I just put all those connections in both my history and my newsletter idea folders. You might have heard that Steve Jobs quote before, creativity is just connecting things. And when you go through this process of revisiting and rewriting your notes, it might take a while, but it also helps you connect the things you're learning to the things you already know, which helps you remember them and keep them in context. And so Sonka Arens suggests doing this once a day, but I actually find that doing it once every few days or even once a week helps me come back to those notes with fresh eyes. It also gives me some time to forget the material before I revisit it, which actually ties into what we currently know about the science of recall and learning, and is important for the next step, which is to write your summary. So about a week after reading a book, I'll sit down and write a summary of what I took from it. And I don't really overcomplicate this too much. I know there are some people who have kind of elaborate templates for every book they read, but for me it's kind of enough to write a quick summary of the key ideas from the book and like how much I would recommend it to someone else. But a key thing I do here is I write the first version of my summary without looking at the book again. That's because several studies suggest that forcing our brains to work to retrieve what we've learned, rather than just passively reviewing notes, forms stronger connections in the brain and helps us to remember stuff better. And then once I've got my summary down on paper, I'll go back through the notes I've made on the book to see if there's anything specific I want to include, or one or two really good quotes that like sum up the theme of the book. And listen, I know this all sounds like quite a lot of work. Stopping to write notes when you read and then like revisiting and categorizing those notes does feel like a lot of effort compared to just jumping straight into the next book. But the way I look at it is, if I spend anywhere between 5 and 10 hours reading a book, then spending an extra half hour or maybe an hour making sure I can remember the ideas from it and use them like 6 months or a year from now is well worth that little extra time investment. But if you want to do all this and still read more books every year, then just a couple of simple tweaks to the way you actually read can do that. So if you want to remember the books you read, but also read more books, then check out this deep dive into how I regularly read 80+ books a year. And I will see you over there.